Good morning, Evergreen. Today we're going to read Chapter 9, Fang Spew and the Mudmort, Part 2. Yesterday we finished up Part 1. Part 2 begins as planned. T-Mouse put out the word that he needed to speak to Flutterby. The way he did this was very simple. He climbed to the top of his tree and hollered for the nearest bird passing by. It normally took a couple of minutes before some curious bird landed near him and asked what he was hollering about. This time, 3 minutes passed before a small bluebird landed on the branch next to him and asked how he could help. Would you please pass the word to Flutterby that T-Mouse, the gecko, needs to speak to him? Sure, answered the bluebird, and immediately took to the sky. The bluebird relayed the message to a swallow, who passed it to an eagle, who passed it to a flock of Canadian geese, from whom it reached the ears of Flutterby. Flutterby, having settled down for the night, set off for T-Mouse's tree at sunrise the next morning. T-Mouse was asleep in his hole and therefore did not see Flutterby's approach and landing on a nearby branch. This bummed T-Mouse out a bit as he found it fascinating that birds could fly through tree branches without hitting them. Upon landing, Flutterby chirped a couple of times until T-Mouse came to the edge of his hole and looked out. Upon seeing Flutterby, he smiled widely and greeted her. Hello, Flutterby, and thanks for coming, and so fast. Sure is nice to see you. Flutterby was happy to see her old friend in such good spirits and shape, and greeted him in return. Hey, T-Mouse, nice to see you again. You're looking good. And I see you've grown your tail back. They both laughed at this, and then T-Mouse got down to business. Flutterby, do you remember when I rode on your back when we were getting rid of the spiked luminoids? Remember how I enjoyed it? It's still one of the best days of my life. Anyway, you mentioned that we might be able to get Fang Spew up for a flight someday. Is that offer still open? We need it. T-Mouse went on to explain the current difficulties with the Mudmort, their desire to move to a different pond, and the requirement to search for a suitable one. He finished with, we don't have any idea of what is around here, and thought a reconnaissance flight would be worthwhile. Can you and a big friend help? Flutterby considered. I have 2 good friends, the Doves, who might be willing to carry Fang Spew. Let me ask them. When are you thinking of taking this flight? Sooner is better, Flutterby, he replied. Today, tomorrow, whenever it fits into your schedule. I'll ask the Doves as soon as I find them. I'll meet with you at the pond, okay? Back shortly, and she was off, skirting the branches of T-Mouse's tree, climbing into the morning sky. T-Mouse watched until she was out of sight, wishing for wings of his own, then climbed down the tree and headed south for the short walk to the pond. Upon arrival, he met with Fang Spew and Bubbles Lime, both sitting on rocks for protection from the Mudmort. T-Mouse shared the results of his meeting with Flutterby and told them he expected her to return shortly. The conversation lagged. 3 were planning a big change, and that was a bit stressful. A loud rush of wings broke the silence as 2 birds came in for landing beside the 3 friends. Their initial reaction, jumping into the pond away from wing danger, was overcome by Fang Spew and Bubbles Lime when they recognized Flutterby, and from what T-Mouse had said, Mr. Dove. He was much bigger than Flutterby, gray in color, as they would find out, quiet in temperament. He talked rarely, and then only in short sentences. Flutterby handled the introductions. She had already explained the entire operation to Mr. Dove and handled the safety briefing. Hold on around the neck, but carefully, no choking, and put your back legs behind the wings. Don't let them hit the wings while flying, it'll be a short flight indeed. With many be carefuls from Bubbles, T-Mouse boarded Flutterby and Fang Spew climbed on the back of Mr. Dove. Flutterby was more than pleased to see the size of... Fang Spew was more than pleased to see the size of Mr. Dove. His back was broad, his wings looked very strong. And at lunchtime, Fang Spew remembered T-Mouse's advice. Hold on tight to the neck, otherwise you'll fall off. Birds take off with a shove and a pump. It's pretty jolting. You can ask Fang Spew for verification if you want. They shove off from the earth in the form of a hard jump and then pump the air with their wings. It's all very abrupt, and Fang Spew would have fallen off but for T-Mouse's words. As it was, he almost got airsick, feeling like he left his stomach back with Bubbles as they climbed out. A gasp escaped his lips, and Mr. Dove turned his head to say the first words Fang Spew had heard him utter. Don't throw up on me. Fang Spew did not have the nerve or energy to explain that frogs can't throw up. They just feel like it. Mr. Dove, upon reaching a height level with the treetops, glided over one of the uppermost branches, landing carefully and looked over his shoulder at Fang Spew. You okay? He asked, not unkindly. Whew, yes. Whoa. Wow. This flying's something. And I'm feeling better too. I like the gliding part, but the climbing part is pretty tough. And do you have to fly so fast? You get used to it. And speed is life. And with that, Mr. Dove launched himself into space, carrying a frog, and what had to be one of the oddest air passenger trips ever. And Mr. Dove was right. Fang Spew did get used to it. Matter of fact, He started to really enjoy it and tried to make mental notes to tell Bubbles. But how do you describe the wind, the noise wind makes as it passes through feathers? How do you put words, the bright sun and watering eyes, and the view? For a frog who sees life at 2 inches above the ground, to be 100 feet in the air is indescribable. You could see forever. And over to the west, the way they were heading was another pond, almost perfectly round with the grass surrounding it. It looked very inviting to the frog, so he nudged Mr. Dove. Can we go down there, please? Land? No. Golf course. Lots of men. Fangspew didn't understand most of that, but the word no came back clearly. He looked elsewhere. And there off to the north, Mr. Dove, in a nice glide over at this point, Fangspew was able to relax, was another pond. It had trees on the north side with a swamp in the south. There was some grass sandwiched between the trees and swamp to the west, so Fangspew asked Mr. Dove about it. How's that one look? No answer, but Mr. Dove altered course toward the north and continued his glide to lower altitude. Fangspew found himself tensing up for the landing, holding onto Mr. Dove's neck a little bit tighter. The landing wasn't very smooth, lots of wing flapping and wind noise, but the touchdown was uneventful, and Fangspew was happy to put his feet on solid ground. Right behind him, Flutterby and T-Mouse came into land. Fangspew was surprised to see them, having forgot about them during the flight. They must have flown right behind Mr. Dove the entire way. T-Mouse climbed down easily and walked over to Fangspew. Well, what'd you think? Did you enjoy it? Fun? Questions mixed with excitement tripped over his lips. Yes, I did. It was great. And you can see so far. What'd you think of this pond? I like it, but let's look around some. So they did. They walked up to the pond's edge and Fangspew hopped in. Ah, nice, very nice, cool. Upon hopping out, he saw Flutterby and Mr. Dove pecking at the ground a short distance away. T-Mouse, what are they doing? T-Mouse studied the birds. Don't know. Picking at something on the ground, I guess. Fangspew hopped toward the birds. I'm asking. He approached the birds. Flutterby, what are you two doing? She looked up from studying the ground, finding and eating worms. We do this every day. Really? Fangspew found the idea of eating worms disgusting, but as a bug eater, he had learned to keep his opinion of others' diets to himself. How do you find them? Shh, we listen. We can hear them underground. There was a very long silence from Fangspew. Thoughtful silence. Fangspew looked at him. Flutterby looked at him. T-Mouse looked at him, sorry. Fangspew looked off into the distance. Then he said, do you eat anything bigger than a worm? Flutterby looked surprised. Of course not. They're plenty big for us. Well, how about other birds? What about, say, an eagle? They're big. Sure, they do. They eat rabbits. Why? What are you thinking of? We have a mudmort problem. Would an eagle eat one if we could get it? Comprehension dawned on Flutterby's face. I don't know, but I know where their nest is. I can ask. But heads up, Fangspew. They also eat frogs. Fangspew. Well, that's a showstopper. Until the eagle would agree to eat the mudmort and not us. What do you think? Maybe an eagle would solve this. Maybe an eagle could solve this for us. Flutterby. I'll be right back. And she was gone in a flurry of feathers. Mr. Dove continued eating, undisturbed by Flutterby's departure. Fangspew and T-Mouse huddled to discuss this idea and waited impatiently for Flutterby's return. And she was quick, and she wasn't alone. She banked in the same spot, landed in the same spot she departed from, and immediately said, do not fear, the eagle's coming. He will not harm you. And it seemed to the frog and gecko that the sky actually darkened as the eagle came in for landing, that he blocked out the sun for a minute, and when picked up, the eagle, all claw, beak, and feathers, landed beside Flutterby, and it was fortunate she warned him. Otherwise, both of them would have been in the water in a vain effort to hide from the large bird. However, they held their ground and looked at the newcomer. He was huge, and huge. His gold beak was enormous, and T-Mouse noticed, look at those claws. They'd cut a gecko in half. Both were thankful the eagle was on their side, but Fangspew couldn't help to question his own plan. Would an animal this powerful really listen to him? There was nothing for it but to try. Mr. Eagle, my name is Fangspew, and this is T-Mouse. Thank you for coming here. I'm hoping, with your help, to get rid of the mudmort. Do you hunt them? The eagle replied in a deep voice. Yes, I do. Rarely catch them, as they're most often underground. What do you have in mind? Well, sir, if I could tell you where to find one in a pretty good time when it would pop out of the ground, would you be interested? Yes, go with details. And Fangspew launched into the details that he and T-Mouse had worked out while waiting for the eagle. The large bird asked several questions and made 2 suggestions that the frog was grateful for. At the end of the discussion, it was agreed. The eagle would orbit to the north end of Black Pond later this afternoon while the frogs tried to call in the mudmort. How will we know when you're there? Asked Fangspew. You won't, the eagle replied. I'll be too high for you to see, but I can see you just fine." That sentence made both T-Moss and Fangspew slightly uneasy. It was disconcerting to discover that animals knew all about them while they were unaware of their presence. Once again, Fangspew was thankful the eagle was on his side. The flight back to Black Pond was quick and uneventful. Fangspew was so deep in thought about the plan that he almost forgot to look around. Almost, but not quite. He put aside his worries and concern and focused on enjoying the moment, loving the view, just living with the wind on his face. Truly, this was the experience of a lifetime. Upon landing, Fangspew and T-Moss gathered the larger frog family. It wasn't hard, as most had gathered to watch the birds and their landing and asked the two flyers how the flight had been. Fangspew croaked for attention. He began, "Family and friends, T-Moss and I have an idea how to get rid of the mudmort. It will be risky like the last time, but this time around we've recruited some help. An eagle." There were gasps from the crowd, and more than a few glances skyward. "He's a friend, and he hunts mudmorts. We'll call in the mudmort, but like last time, if the timing works, the eagle will take him out. And I'm going to need some volunteers again. Do I have any?" Several hands went up. In fact, there were more than several. Fangspew was proud to see this display of bravery, but he chose the same frogs from the first time. They were proven. "Okay, you volunteers gather around. All others, please go back to your rocks and stay well clear of us. And considering there's an eagle somewhere around, you may want to get under cover." The volunteers gathered, the rest scattered. Fangspew explained the plan with the eagle's suggested modifications. The first suggestion was to provide for periods of silence when the rhythmic kicking would cease. The purpose of the silence was to give the eagle somewhere above the opportunity to hear the approach of the mudmort. So the plan called for the frogs to kick 10 kicks, then rest for 5 mental kicks. During the 5 mental kicks, no one would move or talk. The hope was the eagle would hear the mudmort and be able to predict its arrival. You certainly know that eyesight is the eagle's greatest strength. This modification was likely unnecessary, but the eagle thought that it wouldn't hurt. The second idea was the most dangerous one. After the mudmort erupted, the frogs were to scoot away from it, but only enough to stay out of reach. They were not to flee, rather they were to stay close enough to tempt the mudmort to keep him above ground, to keep him focused on them and to allow the eagle time to complete the attack. That was a very scary idea to the volunteers. It resulted in much discussion, but all eventually agreed that it had to be done. An hour before sunset, the volunteers positioned their stones back into the original circle. The hole where the mudmort had erupted the first time was still there, and it was an eerie feeling getting close to it, that it yawned like an open dirt throat. The frogs avoided looking at it and took up their positions with heads pointing away. On Fangspew's command, they began to kick. 10 on, 5 counts of silence, 10 more, repeat, and again. Several times Fangspew looked to the sky, straining to see the eagle, each time failing. In the back corner of his mind, he questioned if the eagle even showed up. If not, the evening could end in death for one of them. The kicking continued. They'd been at it for an hour, frogs getting tired and the sun setting, when Fangspew heard a faint caw from overhead. He excitedly turned to the frog to his right. "You hear that? The eagle's overhead. Keep up the kicking, and let's stop for a 5 count. So they kept kicking with no break. Kicked and kicked. I can't tell you if the kicking worked. I can't tell you if the eagle heard the approach of the mudmort, but I can tell you the eagle saw the mudmort. Everyone did when it burst forth from the earth, all teeth, claw, and rage. It towered above the frogs, black as night, waving its front legs around, grasping for frog food and death. 2 of the frogs scattered, hopping frantically into the pond. The mudmort didn't see those 2, as it was facing the other 3, and the other 3 executed the plan, pushing themselves just outside of the windmilling arms of the mudmort. And the mudmort made its mistake. With its frog just out of reach and not wanting to pass up such a tasty dinner, it maneuvered itself from the vertical to the horizontal, laying itself out in an effort to reach the nearest frog. The 3 frogs saw that move coming and scooted just a bit further away. The mudmort reached further, stretching to its full length, its stomach on the ground, its back to the sky, just as the eagle had planned. The attack of the eagle was a complete surprise to all, even though the frogs knew it was coming. The eagle was all speed and suddenness, claws and wind. The claws took the mudmort from behind the neck. The large wings reversed the descent, and the wind blast sent Fangspew head over heels. One of the other frogs got the wind knocked out of him from a flight feather, and as quickly as it started, it was over. Silence. Nothing. The frogs looked around at the hole. Nothing was there. You might be surprised. Of course, the eagle took the mudmort, but the frogs never thought of that, and why would they? They don't eat mudmorts. They expected to see a dead mudmort lying there and instead there was nothing. Had the eagle missed? Had the mudmort gone back down to the hole? Confusion reigned until Fangspew stopped looking at the hole and started looking at the sky. In the fading light he caught sight of an eagle for the first time, and it was carrying something large in its claws. And to confirm it, at that moment the eagle let out a cry, a wild cry that carried some distance, a cry that announced to the world that he had been victorious in the hunt. The realization of success spread quickly among the volunteers and spectators. Lots of backslapping occurred with some congratulations, and it was about 30 minutes before the frogs calmed down and went to bed. T-Mouse met with Fangspew and Bubbles and relived the day, and Fangspew took great pleasure in kicking their flat rocks back into the pond, where they belong, he announced. Bubbles looked at her husband and smiled. What do you think about staying at Black Pond? I think I've grown used to it. The end.